Welcome to Defy These Times, a podcast dedicated to the easy task of tackling the 21st century. It is a project born out of my conviction that doing so requires an interdisciplinary and intersectional approach to understanding our complex world. I'm your host Gebran Bassil, and in these episodes I bring you conversations at the intersection of politics, history, philosophy, culture, science, and all the fun stuff in between. The following episode was first published for monthly Patreon supporters. To become a monthly Patreon supporter, please head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes or check the website for other methods. You can become a supporter for as little as $1 a month. And if you cannot donate, you can still support this project by sharing with your friends and family and leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. The music of this podcast is by Tarabeat. Here's the episode. Hey everyone, so this is a conversation with Promise Lee. He is a US-based member of the Lausanne Collective, the Democratic Socialist of America, and he does solidarity work with Hong Kong and China's dissident movements. The topics that we discussed are so wide-ranging that I'm actually struggling to summarize it. We spoke about Hong Kong, obviously, and being born and growing up in Hong Kong in the shadow of the Tiananmen Square massacre and after the UK-China handover and how that influenced his own left-wing politics. We discussed the difficulties of navigating online discourses on Hong Kong, Lebanon, Syria, Israel, Palestine, and so many other contexts. We discussed left-wing authoritarianism, i.e. tankies, and how they whitewash regimes such as China's or Syria's or other regimes around the world as long as those regimes call themselves anti-imperialist. We discussed how governments and politicians learn from one another, including quote-unquote anti-imperialist governments and parties. How, for example, Hezbollah and the Syrian regime has learned from the American governments, how the Chinese government has learned from the American government and vice versa, and so on and so forth. I asked him what were his initial thoughts when he first learned about the concentration camps in Xinjiang, and we ended up having a very deep conversation on such things as like the multiplicity of places, how he has a specific anger towards people and governments and states who were oppressed in the past and who now oppress others, namely Israel and China, in the examples that we give. He even mentions the importance of why he identifies as a Hong Konger Chinese and how having both identities matters. And I gave myself as a sort of a response the complicated identities of those who would identify as Jewish and Arab at the same time, either historically or today. We even discussed the example of Hindutva and Indian Muslims. We then got into like a more broader anti-nationalism talk and how that intersects in the global south. We discussed the potential for Black Lives Matter to be globalized either in Hong Kong or in Lebanon or both. And so many other things that I'm honestly barely scratching the surface. This was, as I said, a pretty wide-ranging conversation. So I'll shut up for now and I'll let you enjoy this conversation. I would be very curious to hear your thoughts as always, so please reach out either on Patreon or by email, which you can find on the website. Thanks a lot.
My name is Promise Lee. I'm a member of Lausanne Collective, Democratic Socialist America, among other groups based in the US, but mainly kind of doing international solidarity work now for with Hong Kong and China, the dissident movements there. Yeah.
Well, I mean, before getting into some of the many pieces that you've written, and we have some links, with Lausanne. I've written there once, and I've interviewed, I think you're my third Lausanner on the podcast. I've interviewed Sharon and JP. But I think a good place to start, as good as any really, is if you can sort of talk a bit about your own political trajectory. How have you come to hold the beliefs that you do? I feel like that's just a good place to start this conversation.
Yeah, sure. I mean, my first, I was born and raised in Hong Kong, and my first kind of political awakening, I guess, so to speak, was just, I think growing up just under the kind of shadow of the Tiananmen massacre in Hong Kong, right? And it's actually, I was talking with some other Hong Kongers about this, but it's actually, I think that legacy is weird, right? Because it shaped so much of the city's identity and legacy. And I was really one of the first, I was like the first generation to kind of grow up in after the handover. And it's a weird, it's a weird place where it's a weird situation where I think I wrote about this in various pieces, right? Where I think the legacy of British colonialism gets very kind of delinked or forgotten, or just kind of it's reworked in these kind of strange ways, especially for a new generation that's grown up under very specific, a very visceral kind of state authority, right, and sovereignty under the Chinese government that no one has had the chance to kind of experience really before the generation, right? So I think there's a lot of negotiating and interesting political attitudes. But for me, yeah, I think it was this very simple belief in people's democratic rights should be respected, and censorship is bad or something, right? It's kind of a pretty normal kind of liberal sentiment, right? And I was on the streets when I think the Chinese government was starting to change the textbooks. This is like the moral national educational curriculum. It was like 2012 or something. I was like in middle school or early high school or something. And by that point, I moved to the US, but I still have a lot of links and family back in Hong Kong. So there was that. And then, but yeah, I think really getting radicalized, just being in the US and meeting Marxists. And my first political organization was this small socialist group in the US called Solidarity. And yeah, it's interesting because I feel like I think after 2015 or so, right, people mainly get radicalized through Bernie or through other things, or through the rise of ethnic studies departments in the US. And I feel like the last of a kind of tradition of folks who were radicalized through these very small kind of specific socialist traditions. And yeah, so like some of my early mentors were, I guess, so-called ex-Trotskyists or third camp independent socialists and the like. And it's interesting having to kind of figure all that out in that milieu, my own politics for myself. And they've been very helpful, but at the same time, I think a lot of kind of self-reflection to do, and especially getting more involved with Asian American movements. And I did kind of tenant organizing in Chinatown in Los Angeles for a couple of years. And so it was interesting to kind of bring all that, this very specific tradition, which is often very white, right, but very, very self-conscious of its attitudes towards what it means to build a mass movement, international politics, anti-imperialism, into conversation with being an organizer in Asian American communities and getting in touch with that. And then now obviously doing international work. It's definitely feels like different contexts colliding. And I think with Lausanne, I think we it's definitely holding together a lot of kind of leftist contexts in my brain and trying to piece everything together and trying to find libertary solutions. And here I am still figuring things out. So that's in a nutshell.
Yeah. I mean, the very first episode of this podcast was with JP from Lausanne, and it was a very deliberate decision. I mean, the podcast overall is largely Middle East oriented. There are some stuff that are non-Middle East, obviously, but it was a very, very conscious decision to have something that has quote unquote nothing to do with the Middle East as a first episode. And I mean, for those who have listened to it, and we ended up actually having quite a lot of things in common, and something that I've then explored even more with Sharon. That's episode 46 for those listening, on especially the context of being radicalized through specific events, or because of some people it would be in the aftermath of Tiananmen Square, as you said, or it could be more or less in the past decade, the events of the past decade, whether obviously in the Middle East it's the Arab Spring or what's called the Arab Spring and everything that came after it, or as you mentioned in Hong Kong, the 2012 stuff, and then the umbrella movement, and then obviously 2019. And as it happens, the Lebanon protest happened around the same time as the Hong Kong one, a couple of months or so after it started in Hong Kong. And we saw, increasingly anyway, many of these parallels being made online, usually surface level, usually like actually you feel the people making those comparisons, I mean, like myself, are actually just exploring. They don't really know where this is going to lead, really. But I've always I've been finding that very interesting, hence why I've been still following Lausanne and that work. But for those who don't even know what Lausanne is, can you give some kind of just like, genesis, or how it started and what is it about?
Sure. I just want to be clear. I think we're pretty decentralized, horizontal collective. So definitely there's a range of kind of opinions and perspectives, and we try not to speak too much on behalf of the collective too much. But yeah, so I'll kind of approach uh, um, my role in Lausanne, or what I think Lausanne is from my own perspective, just to name that. But yeah, we started in 2019 when the uprisings in Hong Kong were kind of really bubbling up, and yeah, we were a bunch of kind of Hong Kong and Chinese diaspora leftists who are kind of scattered internationally from the UK to the US or Canada, who are noticing we all come from different backgrounds. Some are media folks, some are organizers, but everyone's kind of everyone would broadly identify in the kind of far left, I would say, and yeah, and just to and really realizing there's kind of a dearth in kind of adequate views to actually look at the Hong Kong situation in its own right, that doesn't kind of tailor it doesn't kind of um, um, get subsumed under the kind of state rhetoric and the programs, right, of the US, of China, and of other kind of programs. And for us, it's this kind of interest in one, letting Hong Kongers, or the diversity of Hong Kong voices, speak. That are often many of which are often elided within the movement itself, right, internally, and trying to have these perspectives as kind of a media outlet. So yeah, a couple of us kind of found each other, some online, and some were like friends, people brought in, and eventually we wanted to do a reading list and disseminate it, and then became like we wanted to end up doing a publication, and then eventually now we're, I guess, something of a ambiguous mix between publication and organization or something like that. And yeah, trying to kind of intervene more now, and show up as diaspora leftists, or folks who have connection to Hong Kong and China, and start to make these interventions through our various contacts and various coalitional spaces, and try to make intervention both through discourse, but also through organizing, kind of behind the scenes, and making these connections, just like the ones you're talking about, right, with other kind of mass movements that have been bubbling from Puerto Rico to Lebanon, and whatever's going on, and then try to stimulate more of these kind of grassroots internationalist solidarity relationships, rather than siding with any state power.
Yeah, I can think of some parallels anyway with a few of my friends trying to do the same in Lebanon. I wouldn't say it's managed to, with the exception of maybe Megaphone News, which is a pretty good one. It's largely in Arabic, megaphone.news for those listening. The others haven't really managed to get that kind of wide-ranging topics that I see Lausanne getting into. There are many, don't get me wrong. They're just small scale just because they're still very new. The public source is another good one, actually, not just Megaphone. But anyway, one thing that I feel has brought me closer to the, for lack of a better word, like Hong Kong activism world, is this tension, or the struggle, or this difficulty at navigating largely online discourses, right? You even list them, so I'm just going to quote you that you started, throw it back at you. Lausanne came together partly in response to an ecosystem of mistranslation. In the summer of 2019, Hong Kong became an overdetermined site more so than ever before, and here's where you list them: a bargaining chip for empires, an intellectual exercise for academics and pundits, a postmodern spectacle for subcultural enthusiasts, and another instance in the United States campaign for subversion against its new rival, or in China's plan to extend its global ambitions. I mean, I can change the words around and use it on Syria. I can use it on Lebanon. There are obviously specifics, to every context. It's not the same. China's plan is not that big in Lebanon. It's not that big of a priority, for example. In Syria, I would speak more about Russia, for example, or Iran for that matter, or Turkey. I can just go on and on. But can you talk a bit about this difficulty of navigating these multiple discourses and having to always, essentially, like, the way I picture it is like I always have to be armed with a dozen different answers at any given time, just depending on the perspective of the person coming at me, and in order to even get to the content, in order to even get to talking
Right.
about the uprising in Lebanon, for example, even before getting there, I need to swift through all of this noise, debunk a lot of things, and then maybe, if we have enough time, we get into the actual topic of discussion.
Right. Yeah, I mean, actually, yeah, I was just talking with some organizer friends about this, right? And I actually think it's very simple. And I think this is actually where experience doing local organizing and community organizing and left communities just organically. I think obviously there are details and there are all these specificities about these places and stuff we all need to learn about. And but at the end of the day, I think in terms of our political values and principles, right? I think for me that something that's very important, right, that I got from growing up in Hong Kong is the value of kind of democracy, right? Just the right of people to be able to determine kind of their own future and their material conditions, right? And so and such a big word in all of this is self-determination, right? And so much of democracy is self-determination. And that's such an immediate and tangible principle that's guided me in every single milieu I've been. And I actually don't think it's that much of a complicated matter, right? It's like this empowering each other, right, in our own kind of context, right, to fight for, fight for like people's right to determine their own material conditions collectively, right, and democratically without coercion, and most importantly, without throwing other mass movements or other communities under the bus, right, for your own. And I think that's a very, honestly, it's a very simple. I mean, it's a very human. Not even it's not even doesn't feel that political, right? And I think obviously we can talk more about like how do you imagine a mass movement? What is your relationship to critical support for certain state powers and all these things? But at the end of the day, I think it's like, I think this informs my perspective, towards movements in Venezuela and Hong Kong, Syria, et cetera, right? It's like the fact that their state repression, their authoritarian powers, and yeah, they all have, you can complicated relationship with capital and with their regimes of governance and all these things. But and obviously there's lots of room for co-optation from different imperial powers, right? But at the same time, it's like at the very core of it, right, is just reminding people that, like, what would you do as a local organizer in your community, right? Is that there will always be contradictions, and there are always people figuring things out. And the answer, obviously, is always, trying and aiming towards these kind of cross milieu, cross kind of coalitional efforts to build each other's capacity for change, right? As working class, as grassroots people on the ground. And to me, the international work is really just imagining that, right, in a much kind of broader framework, right? But the principle remains the same, right? It's like Hong Kongers have the right to determine their own future, just as folks in Lebanon and Syria and et cetera and stuff, in the face of these different kind of nexes of violence, right? And I think, yeah, one thing, and it's going to be complicated, right, in terms of, I think this is even more pronounced, right, in the Lebanon context with all these, with various kind of ethnic groups, and it's like, what does self-determination mean for these groups, and what does it mean to imagine that kind of together collectively in a way that kind of works for everyone? I think, yeah, that is the real question, right? And the fact that we don't even have space to really think too deeply about the nuances of self-determination, which is really kind of my main project. I think my main political question, right? Not this kind of defending state violence stuff that we have to kind of unfortunately get through in the left, right? But yeah, imagine what does self-determination look like, right? In the forms of do we have kind of federated kind of structures of struggles together? I feel like I think those are the real questions that will actually help us strike at the weak points of capital and of these connected networks of state violence, right? That we should be asking. But and yeah, I think the kind of simple truth behind that's the precondition for all these kind of musings or these organizing real organizing questions is a simple fact that, yeah, we should respect communities' capacity for self-determination, for democratic self-determination, and that, yes, like these struggles are always being co-opted, and we do our best to fight and resist against folks who try to co-opt these struggles, like the various actors that I named, right, in that list. And yeah, that to me is a very simple political point.
The paragraph I quoted is from Hayes publication. You wrote an article for them recently, I think, called "Translating Self-Determination: Hong Kong's Water Revolution." Oh, I think that's the general title: Hong Kong's Water Revolution in Contemporary Art and Culture. So to also be, I mean, I will redirect listeners to like episode 1 and episode 46, I think, as I said. But I mean, assuming many won't, because that's a lot of homework. Can you sort of talk about the water revolution? Like, what is sort of the context? What triggered the uprising in 2019, even if just briefly, so that people can actually follow us?
Sure. Yeah. So I mean, right. The larger context is, there was a handover in 1997, and there was a kind of change in sovereignty from the British government, Chinese government, and there's been kind of a slow but increasing kind of restraining of civil liberties, right? I mean, obviously, it's not like there's a lot of civil liberties in the colonial days, right? But there's a kind of new concentration of what we see as the narrowing of democratic freedoms, and it really accumulated right throughout since 1997 and various kind of uprisings. But the 2019 one was really, I think, the kind of biggest one yet, right? The biggest social movement Hong Kong has seen so far, in reaction to this extradition bill, right? Where basically, I mean, it's so wild now. It feels like the details of that feel almost quite meaningless because of how expansive the struggle has became, right? But it became a response to this kind of murder case in Taiwan, where I think Beijing government wanted some sort of mechanism to kind of expedite various sorts of criminals towards its own kind of internal court system. And then activists and legal scholars all agreed that there are significant kind of problems, right, with this new extradition bill that would actually go and encompass also, political, what they deem as political criminals in a much more kind of undemocratic and expansive way. And yeah, I think, I just want to note, there's a lot of kind of mass movement mobilizations that start from student groups and a lot of local community groups and concern groups that really built up the momentum in 2019 before the summer, right? That set the stage for millions of people to kind of pour out in the street by the early summer, right? And so that became the genesis of that struggle, and it kind of continued on in much more militant forms, especially as it feels like the room for change in the electoral kind of the public sphere feels like it's limiting. And yeah, I guess just to jump forward, now that we're almost 2 years away, the movement has, I would say, been effectively crushed, at least for time being, right? And we're kind of now at at the deepest, probably darkest era of repression that the city has seen. And yeah, I think folks are looking for answers and how we can continue the struggle, and also to make sense of the fact of how the struggle has completely transformed Hong Kong identity and consciousness, right? For those of us in Hong Kong, also in the diaspora, not even just at a political level, but at a cultural level. So that's where we are now.
You're right. I mean, so you touched upon this a bit even now, but like the fact that it's been effectively crushed. I mean, yeah, I mean, that definitely seems to be the case, as also from my standpoint. Um, can you sort of, with as much detail as you want, really, and you feel comfortable, just kind of explain how the reaction, or what the reaction has been from the side of the state, really?
Yeah. So so there's a national security laws, right, that were passed last July 2020, and it's a significant expansion, a present expansion and it's absolutely unaccountable state power, right? And they reserve a lot of what rights to deem, what political activities count as secession or national subversion, or these kind of very highfalutin crimes. And yeah, there's no more independent judiciary. There are a lot of closed courts, closed trials now. So it's effectively much more kind of clearly authoritarian in many ways than we've ever seen before in the city. And yeah, I think the state has effectively criminalized or jailed almost all the prominent opposition figures that you can think of. They started off with so the pan-democratic camp built up this kind of unofficial primary to kind of field, to kind of consolidate the opposition around certain candidates in a kind of a bottom-up democratic way, in order to kind of fight for a better chance in a kind of legislative council election in 2019 that's already stacked against the opposition anyways, right? But that ended up became another instance of subversion, which the government now kind of freely interprets. And there are articles now coming out on how how the extent of how uncountable the set of laws, because there's a bunch of leftists online who are trying to say like, oh, all the Western governments also have their same type of legislation, but it's like, no, actually, this is a significant expansion of unaccountable power that that in a scale that you don't even see in certain kind of Western traditional imperial powers. So there's that, and yeah, so most of the opposition's been effectively kind of jailed, and I think when the NSL first began, folks were getting arrested for just having stickers or slogans or something like that, and my kind of the most outrageous one was someone who had a sticker that says conscience in Chinese, and that was apparently evidence of some sort of, I don't know, political subversion. And yeah, so it goes, it's very unaccountable, and there's I think they're trying to be, you don't exactly know how long the sentences are going to be right now. It seems light for a couple people, but it's like you also don't exactly understand. Technically the charges that they're pinning on these people, right, can carry kind of life sentences, right, and that's kind of up to them to determine. And so that's kind of the extent, and I think folks are feeling very scared to kind of organize at all, right. And definitely people are thinking of what it means to even do political activism in such a climate, and there's been a lot of a whole wave of refugees, political refugees and exiles and all that, and yeah, a lot of kind of new paradigms to deal with, and I think that's where we are now. A lot of people are scared to kind of definitely come out to streets, and everyone's very vigilant, hyper vigilant about even saying stuff online, let alone organizing, and that's precisely the climate that Beijing wants to promote, right? And yeah.
Yeah, the fact that you don't actually know how much or like what kind of consequences you might get is as smart as it gets from the standpoint of like an authoritarian government, really, because you can't even calculate the risks. You can't even say, well, maybe this protest is actually worth 1 week in jail, because you don't actually know if it's 1 week in jail, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, I mean, we have seen this in the Middle East as well. I wanted to link this to another point that you made in another interview I was listening to, of like how essentially governments always learn from one another, and this is something that many people on the left don't seem to fully understand when they sort of adopt this what I've been calling the tankies and the campism and all of that stuff. And even if they're not pro Chinese government, let's say, they would always have some kind of some people have called this like a soft tankyism, in some ways like a binary way of thinking, regardless. But the governments don't spend too much time thinking about those binaries. They actually just learn from where they want to learn. Like the best example I always give is the war on terror after 9/11, obviously, especially, I mean, it happened before, but especially since 9/11, a lot of the governments, even those that call themselves anti-imperialist or anti-American or whatever, the Chinese one among them, have been just adopting that same war on terror rhetoric. And this extends to even militias. Like in Lebanon, Hezbollah has had that own war on terror rhetoric. Iran has it, the Syrian regime has it, Turkey has it, Egypt has it. And those are governments that don't even like one another necessarily, like the Egyptian and the Syrian, or the Syrian and the Turkish, or whatever. But they still find these same methods of repression, because, I mean, why wouldn't they, from their quote-unquote perspective? If they want to repress, they're going to find the most innovative way of doing so. And yet on the other side, or those of us who are opposed to them, we're having a bit more difficulty, I mean, from my standpoint, also learning from one another, because we spend way too much time trying to first determine whether the people that are resisting oppression are ideologically pure enough for our own politics or not. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, definitely a lot to say about the collusion between governments, right? And yeah, I think Islamophobia is such an important lynch point, actually, for a lot of these methods. Actually, yeah, I think Islamophobia, especially as it relates or alongside anti-blackness, right, has become very, very productive, a generative kind of engine for world governments, right? Beyond your most traditional Western imperial actors, right? To learn from each other, to keep conducting and building these technologies of surveillance, right, and of policing and of state repression, right? It's directly built off of policing Black and brown bodies, but especially, right, especially Muslims around the world, and especially Black folks around the world. And Yeah, I think I mean the US-China collusion is just so blatant. I actually don't even know how to. I mean, yeah, I think I don't understand. Yeah, I think people like to say as at least even if China's bad, at least it's like the lesser evil or something, which is really funny and ironic because many of these same people would not use this argument when it comes to the two-party system in the United States, right? With the Republicans and Democrats, who quite obviously learn from each other in ways that we can't even begin to fully list. And yeah, I'm trying to make the argument too. Of course, like these modes of, I mean, it's kind of like the two-party system, right? In the U.S., right? We think about international capitalism and global capitalism and the relationship between U.S. and China, right? China's built its economic rise, right? That these leftists love to kind of proclaim on the backs of the Chinese proletariat, on behalf of global North consumers and markets, right? The Chinese government has literally super exploited its own working class, right? For Adidas, for U.S. markets, and for all these things. So I think that's that. I mean, I made a kind of yeah, I made a tweet just jabbing at the fact that there's all these leftists saying Lausan or a bunch of these other groups are we're fueling the CIA and U.S. empire with our rhetoric, and I'm just like, I don't think we're ever powerful enough to uphold the U.S. empire as much as the CCP has, right? In order and to the extent of how much they literally sell out, right? Like sold out their own communities and working class communities to these Western empires, and they're still doing so, right? Through these various kind of economic connections and stuff, right? And so, yeah, Xinjiang is a major example of all these things kind of coming to head, right? And Darren Byler is a great resource for this, especially his article "Made in China" on preventative policing in the region. And it's also highly ironic that I think some of these tankies are now attacking Darren for, I don't know, his various kind of institutional connections or something like that. Well, in reality, most of his resources are actually looking directly at CCP police records, right? At state-run police academies and what type of and really kind of taking the CCP at their own words, right? And he's able to dig up these like frankly incredible resources on how, for example, before the U.S. has even if obviously, like you've alluded, right, the U.S. war on terror has obviously given direct inspiration for the Chinese government to appropriate, and this is all down on paper, right? It's like this is all and this is kind of a part of Darren's research, right? Is that David Petrus's counterinsurgency manuals, right? All these things are being actively translated, and they're peer-reviewed works from state-run police academies in the CCP, right, that are directly trying to adapt this, and they're written records of this, right, and that they freely admit to. My favorite one recently was when the CCP tried to say, this is on Global Times, so but yeah, so I think this is the Global Times itself saying our concentration camps are no different from the de-radicalization centers in UK and France and all these countries. So it's in their own words, right, that they literally learn from Western imperialism and Western imperial methods, right? And so, yeah, I think those are some of the few, if not many, aspects already, right, in which we see these connections. And yeah, obviously there are these kind of inter-imperial rivalry, and especially the U.S. China trade war with this kind of so-called new Cold War tensions. There are obviously going to be these moments of disconnections and rivalry, but at the end of the day, right? No, I think the global economy and also global politics are governed by a shared set of principles among these state actors. And obviously we put out another piece where it's about the kind of American police training the Hong Kong police for years up to this point, and the Chinese government is trying to take in all of these resources from Western imperial powers and then do an about face now, right, by saying, no, we need we're an anti-imperial kind of bastion against these empires. Well, in reality, everything up to that point, and even currently throughout the trade war, right, we're actively, the government is actively colluding and learning from these powers. And, I've seen some tankies try to kind of write this off as like, the bargain or the Faustian bargain or something. And I fully don't understand how that excuses anything or helps their point at all, because I'm like, yes, precisely, there is this hideous bargain, right, that has completely upheld the kind of state of global neoliberal order that both governments are fully complicit in, right? It doesn't mean that both governments are or kind of bad in the same way or something. I think that's the usual charge raised against the kind of the Lausanne crew, so to speak, right? Is that we're flattening the crimes of the two empires. And to me, it's not about saying which one is worse, right? It's trying to say it's the same global system of imperialism, and it's not something you can just merely pin on one nation state, because that's not how capital works. So yeah, that's the long story short, I guess.
Yeah, I mean the Faustian bargain made me laugh a bit because I don't think these people know how the story ends.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
Just today, I mean, we're recording this on April 30th, 2021. Our ex-foreign minister, I mean, Lebanese ex-foreign minister, Gebran Bassil, who's the son-in-law of the president. So we have a very like Jared Kushner, Trump dynamic happening there. He was in Moscow, or he still is in Moscow, I don't know. And he appealed to a very Sputnik / RT narrative. So he called the Lebanese uprising of October 2019, he called it a color revolution. Anyone who follows like Ukraine, for example, knows how the Russian government, the terminology that they use on these things. Essentially, it's a foreign conspiracy, and he actually said that it was a paid conspiracy and so on and so forth. And what's very interesting about him, I always love to quote him. I love to cite the guy. He's a piece of shit, but he's very honest. He's very honest in not giving a shit and just saying whatever is there for the picking. He can appeal to the war on terror. He can say, like, he once he said, like, if you don't help us, as in if you, the EU, don't help us, Lebanon, you will have a refugee crisis on your hands. And what he was saying is that, if you don't help us, we will quote unquote unleash the Syrians, because he knows that that's the only thing that the EU cares about. And, my point is that these politicians, or a lot of them anyway, they are very quickly learning from one another because they sort of live in the same world. They really, I can even cite the fact that recently the Saudi and the Palestinian ambassador, two governments that have never been elected, I should say. The PA hasn't been elected in a decade and a half now. Saudi Arabia, obviously, never. Went on Chinese TV, were interviewed by this, I don't really know who she was. Also, basically saying that they've been to Xinjiang and things are fine, and Hong Kong was a disturbance or whatever terms they used, but they didn't, obviously, disregarding it. And those two people are fascinating to have at the same time. You have on the one side the Saudi and the other side the Palestinian. The Palestinian would then, of course, say that Israel is occupying Palestinian land and this is outrageous, which obviously it is. And then the Saudi wouldn't say anything about it because they're too busy trying to normalize things with Israel. So you have these same politicians in the same room, potentially if they were in different rooms, saying these contradictory things. And yet, when it comes to America and China, you can on the one hand see Henri Kissinger basically praising the Chinese Communist Party, and on the other hand, Tang
and vice versa. Yeah.
Yes,
yeah.
and vice versa.
Praising Henri Kissinger.
Right. Yeah. And on the other hand, Tang who would call Henri Kissinger a monster, which he is, ignoring that bit as if it's just a tiny small detail. Or like I think it was one of the Chinese state accounts also on Twitter. Actually, literally, there was a police day, International Police Day or something 2 years ago, and they put like American cops on one side crushing Black Lives Matter or something, and on the other side them doing whatever they were doing. And so, yeah, just to kind of reinforce your own point that it doesn't surprise me either. It's not something that for me, or at least it's been a few years now since I've adopted a anti-authoritarian first, let's say, politics, or prioritizing that kind of politics, that all of those kind of geopolitical noise ends up being for what it is, noise. At the end of the day, they really do appreciate one another. They do have this affinity, and sometimes they say it pretty overtly. They sound like it doesn't take much, as you said. They just say these things pretty overtly.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and one point about the anti-authoritarian thing, right? It's like, yeah, I think obviously the U.S., China, all these governments are authoritarian in different ways, right? I think it's people like to say it's a loaded term and things, but I think one aspects about the CCP that it's hard to get through, right, with the Americans, especially Western leftists here, is that they don't understand. I mean, obviously, the U.S. is terrible. It's one of the worst imperial powers ever, and destruction and genocide of indigenous people and other folks. Like absolutely, and precisely it's those things, right? That there are these methods that the CCP kind of take in their own hands, right? Not to say that they've done the exact same stuff, but yeah, exactly. Like going back to your point, right? It's like they learn from these strategies. But I think one unique aspect that folks don't understand with CCP oppression is that there's a very devoted interest, right, in smashing people's right to collectively organize. And I don't know, obviously it's not like, the unions are great in the US, right? It's like but I think, very simple point I make is like, you can have service centers in under China. You can't have something like DSA, and this is not even to say like DSA is like some amazing product. It's like, it's shitty and trash in all ways, speaking as a DSA member. And like, but like there's literally no capacity for, like I'm in LA, I do local organizing, and there's all these grassroots groups that I'm in the middle of. Like, there's no chance that all these things can even remotely exist, right? The minute one factory, right, of workers in China wants to build solidarity, something like what you would even call a movement on a local level, right? That's where it calms down. And this is, leftists like to say like, oh, but China saved people from poverty, and like, look, workers get all these benefits. But the point is, it's a very paternalistic, right, social democracy, right? That's very keen, or especially keen actually, because of its own heritage and Marxism or Maoism. Like it knows exactly, right, the power of grassroots organizing, right, of people mobilizing in a democratic, independent way to form movement. It understands the power of that in a way that I think actually the U.S. government and all its failures and complete mess, especially under the Trump regime, right, actually doesn't quite isn't able to quite grasp in the same way, right? So you have this phenomenon where I think people understand that you can't independently organize, and I don't know how much to stress the kind of detrimental reality of that, right? It's like is the surveillance system, in many aspects, life under China or Hong Kong and stuff. There's like, these kind of general capitalistic growth, and there's a lot of ways in which it parallels life here, and for a lot of people, it's, I guess, material conditions are better or something in China and Hong Kong, right? But the point is, right, is I mean, that's how social democracies work, right? And how authoritarian social democracies specifically work is that they give you all these things, right, in exchange for demobilizing, depoliticizing the people. And I think they're able to effectively do that in a way, right, dampening specifically independent politics in a way that I think folks in the US just can't. Again, there's COINTELPRO here is all this nasty bullshit, right? But at the same time, this all-encompassing way, right, in which civil society independent organizing is completely demobilized or neutralized, right? I think it's a scale that Western leftists are just frankly, I mean, this seems like a very controversial point to make, but just don't understand, and there's no way to explain that without being accused of like, oh, what? So you think the U.S. government is better or something? And it's like, no, I'm trying to say it's more nuanced than that, right? They're bad in different ways, and for the CCP, they're bad in a very specific way that, yes, that's authoritarian in a very specific way that most folks here don't understand, and they're unwilling to listen to people on the ground.
It's not controversial on this podcast. A lot of previous episodes have been also on that, depending even on the country. I touched on Venezuela, I will touch soon on Iran, a bunch of places in the Arab world. The stories are pretty similar. I will briefly plug, like, episode 55 was with Zongjing Li and Ally Friedman, and it was on lessons from workers' resistance. They edited this excellent book called China on Strike, Narratives of Workers' Resistance. It's a bit dated now, but I think it's very, very useful as well for people to understand these, multiple stories that they don't know about or may have not heard about before.
Right.
One thing that I try always to emphasize when I speak about, obviously I speak about Lebanon and Syria a lot, and Israel-Palestine. When I say that they're learning from one another, what I also mean is that in the same way as, and this, would be controversial, but I think people listening to this already know my positions on these things. But in the same way as the Israelis would call all Palestinians terrorists immediately, or Islamists, or whatever, Hezbollah actually has its own terms for these things. Hezbollah would be called Islamist terrorists by Israel, but Hezbollah also describes any Syrian who opposes the Assad regime as takfiris, which is a term for unbelievers. It's a synonym or something. And what I'm trying to say is that even those that are at the receiving end of the war on terror, if it suits their purposes, they will also utilize it, because at the end of the day, the goal is power. And in the same way as governments the world over right now are learning, different surveillance technologies from one another, China obviously pioneering a lot of it, and America helping it do so. As you mentioned, a lot of these tech companies, Blackwater and stuff like that. Um, Even militias do that. Even parties do that. Even quasi-government entities, if you want, because the way to become a government from, historically, among other things, is to have a monopoly on power. And among the many tools at your disposal to have a monopoly on power is to learn what from your enemies. So Hezbollah has also been learning from Israel, and this is something that's super super controversial to say, as you might imagine, but it's just there, and the tactics are there, and their own videos are on YouTube. You can just look them up. It's pretty straightforward if you don't have that ideological lens. Um, Filtering all of these things out, because if you have that, that ideological lens, as I'm calling it, well, then it's always justified. There's always a reason behind it. There's always a purpose behind it. We couldn't have just, the answer isn't just the answer. There must be something beneath it, and then you will look for that answer, even if the party or the government or the state that you're defending or supporting, even if they themselves haven't gone that far in supporting it, sometimes they become even more zealous than the party itself. And I see this a lot with tankies on the internet, on Twitter, especially, on Facebook as well and stuff. They tend to literally place themselves, like, mentally in the shoes of Xi Jinping. Like, they think that they are, rationalizing as he might rationalize. And I saw this with Syria. I saw a lot of leftists, including on prominent outlets. Democracy Now! Is one of them, among others. I'm not just singling them out. I just thought of one interview they did, which I will mention another time, not now. But a lot of the time they say, well, why would Bashar al-Assad use chemical warfare? That would not benefit him. And they just think, they think that they're thinking like him. They think that they're putting themselves in his shoes, as if they are themselves the leaders of an authoritarian government. And they reach all sorts of conclusions that have nothing to do with reality. And I see the same thing being reproduced time. The more I expand, it's almost like I can sort of see the patterns. Like, if I see a bit on I don't know, Thailand or on whatever, I can start seeing some of these patterns, and I can almost guess in advance. Like, I did kind of predict that what's been happening on Syria regarding disinformation, like as early as 2014-15, would just be expanded and applied in different contexts. And lo and behold, we saw this happening obviously in Hong Kong, in Nicaragua, in Venezuela, etc., etc. So yeah, just kind of complementing what you were saying, really. So this is none of these questions have been easy so far, but I think this one is possibly particularly difficult. I'm not sure, but I've been wondering if we can talk, or like you can talk a bit about following the repression in Xinjiang of Uyghurs and other Muslim ethnic minorities. I had an interview, that's episode 43, with Rahen Assad and Yona Diamond. Raihan, whose brother is one of the Uyghurs forcibly disappeared by the CCP in Xinjiang. As I said, that's episode 43. The world's most technologically sophisticated genocide is happening in Xinjiang. That's the title. It's kind of, the title says it all. So my question is, or let me preface it with like personal story in some ways, and then I'll ask it. I think that might make more sense. My specific positionality, as Lebanese and Palestinian growing up in Lebanon, which is specific, not in the diaspora, for example, means that I've had a specific attitude towards Syria and or towards Israel-Palestine. That's not just about my opposition to the Syrian government or the Israeli government. I mean, that's one thing in itself. But many people can be opposed to those two without having any kind of direct connection. Which is good. But what gets added to that, let's say objective, or not objective, but depersonal opposition to all kinds of authoritarianism is something more personal. It's like a personal wound that I see being replicated in multiple spaces, because both Syria and Israel were military occupiers of Lebanon. Syria, for those who don't know, from 1976 to 2005, and Israel from 1982, although parts of it started earlier, until 2000. And so when you look or hear about, or witness, let's say, the bombings in Gaza in 2014, or the bombings in Aleppo in 2016, or whatever, it gets added, and on top of just the horror of the thing in itself, what gets added is that, well, something similar happened in not too distant past in Lebanon, although at different scales, I should say. And I'll briefly mention. So what I'm trying to get at is that essentially what ends up happening is that there are multiple Palestines, multiple Syrias, multiple Lebanons, multiple Israels, if I want to be a bit provocative, that just gets into my way of thinking, and I'm able, better than I used to. It's still very difficult to sort of navigate these multiple um, representations, or what have you. I don't know how we want to call them, but like when someone, let me think of a concrete example. But when someone, like, I lived in Scotland and England, and a lot of the time it almost became a cliche, unfortunately. But a lot of the time when I would see a white person, usually a white man, wearing the keffiyeh, the Palestinian keffiyeh, I would almost start having my doubts automatically. Like, is that person, does he have shit politics? Because it just became associated with a lot of people who almost in their, I don't know, if I want to be generous in this interpretation, I can be less generous. Like being more passionate about us than we are, let's put it that way, um, sort of actually take on this mantle of, like, they're trying to be more Palestinian than Palestinians, to use that metaphor that a Palestinian friend actually used in one of the episodes in the past. And I spoke about this with Ida Hozic, who's from Bosnia, who, from Sarajevo originally. That's episode 69. And we ended up discussing multiple Bosnias, essentially, as she calls it, and multiple Syrias as a kind of my contribution to the conversation. So, with that in mind, if that makes sense, like, my question to you is more, what were your first thoughts when you, if you remember them, when you first heard of the camps in Xinjiang, for example, if that makes sense?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Yeah, a lot of scattered thoughts, definitely. Yeah, I mean, of course, it's a hatred for what the government is doing there. And I think, yeah, I was gonna say, I think I had like a long-term amateur interest in Islam and like Islamic history, and especially the connections of politics in Central Asia, Middle East, and South Asia. I've been always trying to kind of learn more about, right? And a very influential classroom in college was actually first learning about kind of Islam through the lens of Iran and Persia and like the lineages there, and a relationship with how, where these like ulamas at the time like imagined categories of political sovereignty, and how does that work with mass movements or dampening. So I think I've always been very interested in that, and also, yeah, the phenomenon of Islamophobia, right? And then and how, again, like I gestured to this earlier, right? And how that became kind of a huge, yeah, what does it mean to show solidarity with that? What does it mean to understand, that the specific experience, right? And I think, this diverse set of experiences associated with certain religious traditions, and yeah, I think, I guess I'll first say, I have a very specific kind of gripe or hatred, right, for people who, ethnic minority, or, I guess, ethnic peoples who were formerly, oppressed by imperialism, right, or impressed by others, and now are doing kind of similar things, right, onto other oppressed. Like, I just have a specific gripe, but like that's why it was easy for me to hate Israel, China, like, or I mean, just like the governments of Israel and CCP and stuff like that, because I think that just especially rubs me the wrong way. And I think, as someone who, identifies Hong Kong Chinese, right? I think I specifically don't just say Hong Konger, because I do stress, yeah, I do find meaning and solidarity with the Chinese heritage, right? And I feel like a specific responsibility, right, to be able to confront the fact that, there's a state that's trying to monopolize, what the Chinese identity should be, and is doing its own sort of, violence, right, onto, another set, of different ethnic minorities, right? For one, doesn't include just Uyghurs, right? Kazakhs, Tajiks, and a bunch of other ethnic minorities that friend, Nerdok, who wrote this amazing piece for us, and Daikon, that was also in Lausanne, also, always really stressed, right? It's also, of course, it's majority Islam, but there are also Buddhists and other kind of, religious minorities, but also ethnic minorities, right? Under a specific and very deep kind of repression from the Chinese government. So yeah, definitely I think that's definitely one of the first thoughts, right? Is that yeah, like I think as a Hong Konger, we need to learn about the diversity of the context in Xinjiang, not to simply just instrumentalize the struggle, so to speak, right, for some sort of collective cause against the CCP, right? But to understand, I think in order to understand the complexity of the situation in Central Asia, but also the specter of Islamophobia, right, necessarily entails, thinking about the world system as a very complex phenomenon, right, in which a lot of these things intersect with each other, and I think actually speaks very importantly to something I was gesturing at before, right, like what does self-determination mean? What does self-determination mean in the context of the Uyghur people, right? What does the self-determination context mean in the context of secular folks, right, who are in these regions, but also in relationship to kind of political activists who are Muslim and things like that, and how these kind of refract very, very differently, right? Be it in Pakistan or Iran or Syria, Lebanon or Xinjiang. And I think there's something humbling, but also despairing, right, about the level of surveillance again, which I think the Western left fails to understand, right? And I think feeling I don't know, feeling like I think it's similar with Hong Kong and just wanting to, what it means to keep supporting in solidarity the voices there, right, and uplift the diversity of voices there, while trying to find room for solidarity and resistance, right? And in the current climate, in a sense, even more so in Xinjiang than Hong Kong, right? There's even less room for any sort of rigorous kind of political organizing because of how heavily surveyed and the climate is, right? So I think, actually, I don't know. At the end of the day, not a lot of kind of smart thoughts. Just I think feeling a collective despair, but also feeling like we're not alone in the struggle, but also like frankly, just to be very honest, like not totally sure how to move forward besides just like learning about the complexities of the situation and trying to not just learn enough to like bolster my own point of like combating the CCP, but learning enough to just know the David Brophy's research, right, Goldana and Salimjan in Vancouver, I think, just have these amazing research on just the complexities of situations on the ground. And that actually means there's no easy answers, right? It's not just combating the CCP. It's about what does it mean to talk about self-determination for a region that's been so complicated and determined by different state powers in different ways, and constantly sorting out, what does it mean to be Uyghur? What does it mean to be Uyghur alongside Kazakhs? And what does it mean for all these people to be kind of allied with each other and this reality of oppression, but also trying to find collaboration to sort through contradictions, right, among each other. I think there's no easy answers, and frankly, it's one of those moments where I'm just like, I actually don't know what the political answer is, right, or what self-determination can actually concretely look like, and I'm just learning. So
no, I mean,
humbling and despairing.
I mean that's fair. Honestly, that makes sense. And the whole, I think it's a question of time. So when you mention that Western leftists don't usually understand the urgency of things sometimes, or how the scale of the oppression can be very different. I see this a lot, of course, with Syria. That's a very obvious thing where many people, even those who are not particularly fond of Bashar al-Assad, don't seem to quite grasp what we mean, or what Syrians especially mean, when they talk about him. Not him only, but like the regime in general.
Right.
Because the speed of the oppression is as important as the nature of the oppression. Like if he was, I mean, to be very crude about this, if he was dropping 1 barrel bomb every year, that would not be the same thing as dropping 1,000 barrel bombs in a month, to be very, very basic about this. But that's the sort of situations Syrians have found themselves in. And a lot of the discussions of should the revolution have been militarized or should it not, I mean, it's an important conversation. Syrians have been having it ever since it started. But one thing that's missing in these conversations, and usually to kind of be a bit general about this in non-Syrian contexts, is this understanding of, well, what else could I have done? Even those who are not happy with it even those that were and still are for good reasons, are very concrete critiques and even oppositions to a lot of how demilitarization started happening around 2012, 2013. I don't see many Syrians express these things online because, from my impression, and I've had some conversations that sort of confirmed these suspicions, they're just afraid that this will then be co-opted. Like if they express regret, let's say, that the revolution was militarized, well, it takes 5 seconds on someone on Twitter or someone on Facebook to say, haha, well, clearly that was a mistake, and therefore, obviously, everything that has followed is deserved. And and this is kind of an awkward pivot, but you mentioned the importance of mentioning that you identify both as Hong Konger and Chinese, and there is a lot of literature now, I think, on the very complicated identity of being both Jewish and Arab. And that's something, Ella Shahat obviously mentioned this a lot. The book is called On the Arab Jew, something which I recommend. And I'll get into this more in future episodes. But one thing that many people, and in this case, even in the region, so even in Israel, even in Palestine, even in the Arab world, often don't seem to know, let's be very generous, is that a lot of these identities were forced out of people. So a lot of people would actually identify as Iraqi Jews, for example. And of course, it benefited Israel for that to stop. But what a lot of people, especially on the Arab side of things, don't seem to want to recognize is that Israel didn't just do it on its own. It wasn't just that they appealed to Iraqi Jews and Iraqi Jews overnight felt like, well, let's move to Israel now. There were concrete problems, largely promoted by authoritarianism and the authoritarian dimension of pan-Arabism, I should be more specific, that have forced a lot of people to either declare their loyalties, essentially, which effectively meant sort of shutting up about being Jewish, or or leave, basically. Like that was essentially the only two options left, or obviously suffer the consequences. And many people obviously opted to leave. Not that it was much of a choice. And we saw this story time and time again in pretty much all of the contexts, that in Yemen, in Ethiopia, not even necessarily Arab contexts, but those are stories that complicate the narrative of just Israel Arabs or Israel Palestine. And at no point does it justify anything that the Israeli government has done. But many people would prefer to kind of ignore the fact that most Israeli Jews are actually from the region in terms of ancestry. They're Mizrachis. They're from the East, that's what Mizrach means. And this complicates the story. It doesn't make it better. It doesn't mean that the Israeli government is any better, obviously. But it just means that, well, we should also pay attention to that other thing. And a lot of people are uncomfortable. And here I'm not talking even about Palestinians. I'm not talking about people in Palestine specifically. I'm not talking about those in refugee camps. They have enough problems on their plate, so I'm not blaming them for not being quote unquote more nuanced or whatever. Like it's a discussion of privilege in many ways. But it is something that I've been more and more thinking about more recently, because, to put it very crudely as well, if the Iraq or Syria or Lebanon or Libya a bit less, but Yemen, for example, Yemen is a big example. If those were places that were safe for Yemeni Jews or Iraqi Jews or whatever, Israel wouldn't have a huge part of its population right now living in Israel. The project, quote unquote, of Zionism, to broadly defined here, and here I will have an entire episode on that with Daniel Randall, so which will already be out by the time our episode is out. A lot of these pressures, or let me put it differently, a lot of this politics of simplifying identities never benefits those that think it would benefit them. So Hong Konger nativists who want to have a very strict binary, you're either Hong Konger or Chinese and that's it, don't seem to understand that this benefits Chinese nationalists. It doesn't benefit Han nationalists, I should say, like, the Xi Jinping crowd or even people around him.
Yeah, absolutely.
It benefits him. And in the same way as, Hindutva in India, for that matter, Indians who are Muslims, which most would identify as Indian Muslims, to be very clear, if there was a similar movement as we see with some of the Hong Kong nativists, it would just benefit Hindutva. Hindutva wants, and many of, especially those more blatant about it, want to ethnically cleanse Muslims from India. And if there starts being a movement that starts saying, well, we're not Indian anyway, well, that just benefits them. That's it. We've done the work for them. And always by having multiple identities at the same time, this is when we complicate their lives. We complicate the lives of these authoritarian regimes. And I feel like this is something that's really, really like very poorly understood, to be kind of nice about it. And I admit it does frustrate me a lot.
Yeah. No, I'm sure. I think the Middle East, it's definitely. I mean, the interesting thing about the Hong Kong context is that it's so new, right? This defining of the Hong Konger against the Chinese, and a lot of I think a lot of the stuff you're gesturing to, it's very salient with the Jewish identity, right, throughout these different regions, right? Like there's such a deep and long, complex heritage, especially these different governments, and with Israel and stuff, and I think there's a lot of food for thought there, especially with the group people, and there's actually a lot of discussions about Israel and Jewish identity, especially in Hong Kong circles now, actually, in the diaspora, right? Because diaspora literally came from that context. So there were people starting to think about this, and not always in the most progressive ways, but yeah. So definitely, I think there are people thinking about the complexities of Jewish kind of identities and stuff in the region. But yeah, I think absolutely. I'm not like I don't fault people who, again, I think this part of the self-determination thing and how I think people should be able to freely determine their identities. But for me, it's like, I'm pretty rigidly anti-nationalist in the sense that, especially ethno-nationalist, but nationalist, right? In the sense that I think even third world national liberation movements, like those have all been, there's social democratic gains, but they've ultimately been dead ends. And I think there are a lot of ways even someone who's not, I don't know, an anarchist or whatever, right, like Fanon would look at, right, like the limitations of these identities. And for me, I definitely take that. I think the experience in Hong Kong has definitely taught me to never trust just simple, or to believe that national liberation, or thinking about things in the context of national liberation, especially ethno-national liberation, can somehow bring about any kind of long-term positive change, right? And so I think my straddling between Hong Kong and Chinese, and the Chinese part's also complicated because, I think being in the United States, right, as an Asian American, right, like that is the main way I'm being coded, right? And I organize with Chinese American immigrants. I organize in Chinatown, and I'm being read. It's like and then especially under the sector of xenophobia, right, which is very real. I think I do feel solidarity, and I feel. And for me, I think my straddling between the two is a way to, in a way, to show solidarity both, but at the same time, a way to show my opposition to both. And one, trying to say I'm Chinese to Hong Kongers, to show my kind of, opposition fundamentally to localist way of thinking, right, nativist way of thinking, but also saying I'm a Hong Konger because as an affront to the Chinese government's attempt to monopolize, right, the diversity of Chinese identity. And I think to me, it's about occupying this sometimes hegemonic and sometimes not hegemonic term, right, and trying to articulate and own up to Chineseness or Hong Kongerness or something, right, in my own way, right, and show diversity of identity. That's not just reducible to the stuff that you see in Child Collective or the CCP propaganda, right, where it's nationalism and Chinese identity. It's like, no, there's a rigorous tradition of Chinese intellectuals being extremely self-deprecating, right, about the situation in China, and actually, a lot of it's problematic and a lot of it's very intellectually interesting, right? And to me, that's it's always about the independence of ideas and people to think. And for me, it's about occupying these kind of problematic and very loaded terms, right, and just trying to be myself and make my political interventions, because that's what I think socialism is, at least for me, is right, as people. We have the right to determine what we think, works for us, and to advance, political concepts and ideas, and work with others with our own kind of will and encourage to redefine things and subvert things. So that's just a short response to kind of what you said.
I can link it as well again to what you were saying now to Lebanon, because this is gonna sound very, very weird, but I'll just explain myself. The party in Lebanon that does internationalism best is Hezbollah. And the reason why I say that is that they at least speak to Iranians, they speak to Iraqis and Syrians, and they speak to Palestinians and Yemenis. obviously from a very narrow perspective that benefits ultimately only the Iranian government. But my point is that most of the people who are anti-Hezbollah, obviously I'm among them, with the exception of those trying to propose a more progressive alternative, obviously me trying to do the same. The megaphone people that I mentioned before, the public source people I mentioned as well, they definitely do that kind of work, which is very important. Most other people who are just anti-Hezbollah mostly just appeal to a nationalist rhetoric. They mostly just say we want Iran out of Lebanon. And while I totally agree that I want the Iranian government out of Lebanon, the problem is that it's not enough of a salient narrative to just compensate for what for Hezbollah's narrative, let's say, or Hezbollah's discourse anyway. And that's another example of how many people who would call themselves anti-Hezbollah in Lebanon, or anti-Iran, let's say, don't have the same kind of dynamism that Hezbollah, which is anti-Saudi Arabia, that they do. Hezbollah is very happy to inhabit all kinds of contradictions, all kinds of hypocrisies, because they're, happy. I mean, because they're comfortable in their position of power. They are essentially the government right now. But all of those that want to propose alternative narratives, for the most part, and I'm actually going to link it to a question I had for you. For example, one weakness that I identified early on, and I'm not the only one, many people have, of the protest movement in Lebanon in October of 2019, is a lack of intersectionality, to be very kind of broad about it. There were some within the movement, especially feminists, they were the most vocal ones, there was a video that went viral of like revolution in every country that ended up being the title of my conversation with JP on Lausanne. And they would kind of extend their solidarity to migrant domestic workers that suffer under the racist kafala system in Lebanon, and obviously refugees, Syrians and Palestinians, Iraqis and Sudanese and others. But they were really a minority. Most people simply appeal to let's wave the Lebanese flag and we have to come together because the main thing that they were opposing, that we were opposing, I was there, is sectarianism. And what's one good way of opposing sectarianism? Well, nationalism, really, or patriotism, to be kind of lighter about it. It doesn't matter if you're Shia or Christian or Sunni or Druze, we're all Lebanese in the end. And while that's like a step forward-ish compared to the previous, or compared to sectarianism, let's say, or at least many would argue so, it doesn't get into class, it doesn't get into race, it doesn't get into regionalism, it doesn't get into the issue with citizenship in the first place. Not everyone can be Lebanese in the first place. You cannot become a Lebanese, you can only inherit it. And that's a very patriarchal and sectarian thing. Those things weren't really developed in the same way. And I would say that in 2015, we had a big uprising, which I was part of as well. And while I would say it was more excusable back then, if that's really the term, or at least more understandable back then, because it was the first big movement of the post like quote unquote post-war era since the 90s. I would say that in 2019 we should have learned a bit faster from the mistakes of 2015, and we did learn a lot of mistakes. Don't get me wrong, a lot of mistakes were learned. Anti-sectarianism as a big one, anti-classism sort of. It started getting there, but not as much as certainly that I would have preferred, and definitely anti-regionalism, you might call it, like actual solidarity between people in the north and people in the south and that sort of thing. And that's very important. It's crucial work, but it definitely didn't extend to a significant percentage of the population that live in Lebanon that just don't have the citizenship: Syrians, Palestinians, Ethiopians, and so on. And for me, that's not just a detail in the story. It's not just we should be nice because it's good to be nice, but because that implies that if we're not nice, it doesn't matter. That's what it implies, My point is that a huge part of Lebanon essentially is simply not being talked about, is simply being ignored, and that weakens the movement itself. Like, that's my actual argument, is that it's not that we should just extend a hand to Ethiopian migrants because that's a good thing to do. I mean, obviously it is, but it's because they are a specific part. I meant to say, like, they form a specific part of Lebanese society of Lebanon, I should say, that is simply being ignored, and we can't really build a concrete and strong resistance movement, essentially, and in actual opposition that intends to remove the government in power, because that's what الشعب يريد إسقاط النظام, the people want the downfall of the regime. That's what it means. But how do we force that regime to fall down without understanding the multiple tools at its disposal? And racism is among the tools at its disposal. Sectarianism, regionalism, classism, misogyny, obviously, homophobia for that matter, and transphobia as well. So yeah, a bit of a ramble on my part, but the link that I wanted to make is that you have yourself tried to bring closer, I guess I would say, the Hong Kong protests with the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, in the US. And
right.
I mean, that's difficult to do in itself, so I appreciate the effort. And I would, so I'm just asking you to sort of talk a bit about that, and I would be interested if you can sort of discuss sort of the reactions you may have encountered trying to do that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that yeah, I mean, I just want to say, yeah, definitely the I think we actually both wrote similar pieces around the same year about migrant domestic workers. Actually, I remember reading your piece on that.
Yeah,
and I
we
think
did.
I yeah, I did an open democracy piece on that too, and so yeah, definitely, I think and I think Hong Kong in a much less rigorous, just less, actually slightly less complicated sense. Yeah, I think was learning the mistakes of sectarianism, and I think sectarianism in a much less, I mean that in a much less deeper way, from like the literal kind of all these like these codified divisions in Lebanese society. But yeah, I think it was a lot of splitting, a lot of people kind of shitting on each other, and yeah, this whole like no platform, we're all Hong Kongers thing was also kind of a reaction to that, right? So it's almost like this sense of unity that has since elided, problematically ended up narrowing the space for political diversity, in my opinion, right? And calling out the problematic forces, right, was supposed to be a corrective to the errors of umbrella movement in the wake of that. So I think that connection is very salient. And again, it goes back to the point of, I think the real question that we should all be asking is, yeah, what does self-determination look like, right? What does self-determination look like in the face of respecting people's right to self-organize, right? Freedom to secede from each other's programs, but also be able to join together in coalitions. Like, what does that look like? What does that mean? And how do we do that productively and democratically, like moving forward? Right? I think that's a really deep question. And yeah, so I mean, I think the migrant domestic workers thing relate to the BLM stuff, because I think people in Hong Kong like to, it's like, oh, you leftists are always talking about like everything under the sun, and we have this one struggle to focus on, and blah, blah, right? That's usually the whole thing, and we're bringing up too much random things that are obviously important. Like, no one's saying they're not important, but like, why bring it up now? And my answer is always like, yeah, I think these are interventions that precisely are meant to point to the very limits of, I mean, what I was trying to make, the argument I was trying to make in the migrant domestic workers piece, right, is the fact that population points to a very central class divide in Hong Kong society, right? That's not just like something that people should think about. It's like, this is the core limitation for me, and what's limiting our horizon for political freedom, right? So I think the importance of talking about migrant domestic workers is the fact that, yeah, a lot of people were able to go to protest because there's a lot of, there's some like there's a lot of middle class protesters, and there's like, they're able to do so because of this care work, right? That's extremely elided, right? And that forms as a huge core of Hong Kong's economic system. And so, yeah, I think that it's about, like listening to migrant domestic workers, but it's also thinking about like, what is the stakes of us ignoring them, right? And how is, like, the fact that we have ignored these voices, how that actually point to a concrete central limitation of how we imagine this whole thing that we're working on. And that's precisely the same move that I tried to do with the Hong Kong Must Stand with Black Lives Matter piece that I co-wrote with JS, another Lausanne member, right? It's to say that, yeah, okay, obviously, if you just look at the title, it's like, it's just like, it's another one of those pieces. It's like, oh yeah, we should stand with each other, right? But like, the point of the intervention is saying like, anti-Blackness is a global phenomenon. And like what I just said earlier, right? It's been a very important source for governments to develop their programs of surveillance and racism and divisions. And the fact that Hong Kongers don't really know how to talk about anti-Blackness, or the fact that like people don't really know what to do with the Black Lives Matter movement, right? I think points to the fact that we haven't seriously thought. I think thinking about Blackness, right? Thinking about Black folk society, you can't not think about global systematic injustices and how they all connect to each other, right? And I think that's precisely, it precisely shows something that's very central and limiting in Hong Kong's struggle, right? By looking at seemingly something that's in the margins or not related, I think the move here is trying to point to the fact that us refusing, or us like we not having coherent answer or solidarity, program solidarity with such a movement, at least in that point in last year, I think it actually reveals a symptom, right, of a particular set of weaknesses, right, and how we imagine our struggle, why it's been so limited, why we don't kick out right wingers from our ranks, why we don't have the language and discourse, right, to articulate, not just some like principled sense of freedom, right, but a pragmatic sense of freedom. Because for me, it's about, you need to make these economic critiques. You need to make these cross-border solidarities in order for your own fight to be actually successful in the fight of such a large, gargantuan kind of authoritarian power. Like we need, I think that's the thing I'm trying to always cite, right, is the fact that I'm talking about all these things, Black Lives Matter, migrant domestic workers, not because, I'm just an idealist, right? It's like, no, we need allies, right? And I have the right to be like the political allies that a lot of the people in Hong Kong have been seeking are trash, like Marco Rubio and Josh Hawley. And I think they're always like, oh no, but you're troubling like our avenues for freedom. Like, no, these are precisely the wrong allies that are limiting our freedom. And I'm trying to talk a register where I'm like, no, I'm trying to propose pragmatic allies, right, who would actually help our cause and also for us to help their cause, because not only because it's right, I mean, it is right, but it's hard to speak to Hong Kongers just in the register of principles and idealism, because a lot of folks just don't care or something, or they think you're, being, idealist, right? But you're like, no, this is literally, these are pragmatic allies. These are real effective coalitions that can allow us to effectively fight state violence, not just for us, but for anywhere. Like it's, and yeah, so I think the reception has been, wild, obviously, and I predicted it. This is pretty funny. I think Anonymous kind of reshared it, like the hacker collective, and so that millions of followers, and so it just went like softly viral for a bit. And yeah, it was, my phone was blowing up with notifications for like days. Just right wingers just shitting on it, left everyone was shitting on it. Obviously got a lot of support, but it was also like, it's like, how dare you equate your fascist movement to the Black liberation struggle? Or it's like, how dare you, equate like Black people, like they're like lesser than our struggle. So from like the right wing nativist crowd, and there's just like all this stuff. And it was definitely, my lesson is it helped me just be like, obviously I take in opinions and I rework my perspectives, but just be like, confident in my own political interventions, right? And that I'm never gonna, I think that was really the moment where I'm just like, oh yeah, definitely. If there was any doubt about it, like that was a moment when I'm like, yeah, definitely not gonna please everyone, and that's not really the point anyway. So, but yeah, so it was a lot kind of responding. But that piece led to kind of we did a webinar connecting activists from Black liberation movement here in Hong Kong, and that was, I thought it was very successful. It was like hundreds of people attending, and yeah, I think it, again, this is a long struggle and this is a small step, but that's I felt like we were able to make certain interventions, and glad about that in face of the very chaotic reception. So yeah.
I just remember that right around the time Black Lives Matter happened again, the couple of weeks after George Floyd's murder, there was a not just an American outcry, obviously, but also kind of this very interesting international phenomenon. There was a lot of discussions of like, what would Black Lives Matter look in different contexts? We saw in France very interesting stuff happening, in the UK, obviously, as well, in Canada as well, Australia, and so on, New Zealand. But we saw one in Lebanon, and the one in Lebanon was actually extremely cringy. It was very, very problematic because they didn't think, I mean, the people specifically that I'm mentioning, I and others tried to actually make the argument of like, if Black Lives Mattered in Lebanon, the kafala system wouldn't exist. Here, I'll just mention kafala means sponsorship. For those who don't know, essentially is the method of governance of migrant bodies, if I put it that way, by the Lebanese government. Essentially, that their legal status is tied to the kafil, the Lebanese sponsor. And I have a number of episodes on kafala, including with migrant domestic workers. So like people can just type in kafala if they want. It's KAFALA, whatever podcast you're listening to. But those in Beirut, I remember, just went like Lebanese Lives Matter. and they didn't include well, everyone else. They didn't include actual Black lives in Lebanon, Ethiopians most notably, some Sudanese as well, and so on, or even like racialized people like Sri Lankans and Filipinas and so on. Obviously, they didn't include other Arabs like refugees, like Syrians and Palestinians. It was a shallow, simply attempt to co-opt. Maybe they meant well, maybe not. It doesn't really matter. But it was one of those things where like, well, that wasn't it really. You didn't. That wasn't the point. If we wanted to have a like BLM in Lebanon, which I still think would be useful. It's a useful rhetoric, or it's a useful framework, I should say. It's not exactly the same. There's no equivalent of like the Atlantic slave trade or anything like that. It's not the exact same thing. There's very particularity, obviously, to Black Lives Matter in the context of America, obviously. But there are echoes, there are interesting parallels that I would say, in the same way as anti-blackness derives a lot of international authoritarian politics. In Lebanon, there is a version of that. It's very quintessentially Lebanese, I should say, but it does exist, and something to look at. I'll maybe do some episode on this at some point. So last thing before we kind of get into the book section is we ranted about lefties and tankies especially, and that sort of thing, and we can go on and on, and there's been other episodes, so maybe I won't torture you with this too much. One thing
that's my whole life too.
Yeah, I know.
My whole life, Nazi somehow. Yeah,
I know. So, I mean, one thing that I do think is relevant to point at, the initial piece that I read that led me to invite you, is this piece that you wrote for Lausanne called "Fighting Anti-Asian Violence Cannot Include Apologism for the Chinese State," end quote. I mean, the title is it's self-explanatory, but can you sort of talk about this, also contextualize it for those who may not know the violence that you're reflecting about? And I will also mention that I had an interview with Kate Zen from Red Canary Song. That's episode 39, which unfortunately a lot of the things, and that was last year, and unfortunately a lot of things that she had to say in that episode were manifested in the most horrible way in America, about a month or so ago. So yeah, if you can just contextualize it and contextualize that article, talk a bit about it as well, and obviously everything we're talking, I will link them in the description.
Yeah. I think Kate's resources and takes are very good on the background of the right-wing stuff, especially in the Asian American communities. But yes, anti-Asian violence has been spiking since the COVID stuff and Trump and everything, and yeah, I think especially with Atlanta murders, right, of the massage workers last was it 2 months ago now, or no, sorry, still last month, and well, I guess months ago now when this comes out, but yeah, it's really kind of stirred a lot of activism, and I think a spotlight in Asian American communities that has never been seen before in that level. And I'm again wearing different hats as sometimes help out with these organizations, and just as a Chinatown organizer and as someone doing the Lausanne work. And I think there's a lot of stuff going on, right? And it reveals also a lot of contradictions, right, in the Asian American community. And I've been never one for advocating, I'm always kind of like class lines over ethnic lines in terms of organizing as much as possible. But yeah, so for example, the issue of sex work, right? The issue of policing, and now, yeah, the issue of what to feel about the Chinese Communist Party, right? I think these all became flashpoints and divisions within the community that I think people aren't ready to talk about, or just are kind of alighted, right? And I was specifically responding to, so there's Answer Coalition, right? That I feel like your listeners might be familiar with already, right? Part of the tanky anti-war infrastructure in the U.S., right? And only showing up when the U.S. bombs someone and silent when Russia bombs, Syria. But that's the thing. But they did the whole, programming on like stop Asian hate, and stop China bashing. So it's like very like disingenuously kind of putting those things together, right? And I think there's even kind of a lot of discourse in the U.S. where it's like, yeah, we can't demonize China because that feeds into anti-Asian hate, and there's not really like a alternative to that in discourse and organizing that can both obviously, yeah, like combat xenophobia, right, but at the same time we're not going to throw the mass movements and dissidents under the CCP under the bus, right? I think there's a lack of that, right? And I think Answer Coalition has really been able to kind of capture that, and then did a national day of action across different cities. And so that was what I cited in the intro, right? That I was responding to, right? That actually, you know, if we're going to talk about anti-Asian violence, right, and anti-Asian racism, right, the CCP, we can't have a movement against that, right? That without taking into account the crimes of the CCP, right? And you know, yeah, obviously the right wingers and the centrists are trying to capture this, right? This program to advance their kind of anti-China, they're, you know, building up the military-industrial complex in the U.S. But you know, I think this is the analogy. I don't think it's even an analogy at this point, right? But to think about like the Me Too movement, right, and how sexual assault, you know, people are like abusers are dealt with in movement spaces, right, and how it's a similar rhetoric. It's like we, you know, it's like in less spaces, like we shouldn't call out abusers or something because, oh no, that will just, you know, amplify the voices of the right wing or something, right? And I feel like this is the geopolitical version of that, right? And again, it's not even an analogy because they're literally doing this for, you know, Uyghur women in Xinjiang, you know, with all these issues, and trying to be like, oh no, they're just CIA funded or whatever, right? So it's almost like, it's not even an analogy, it's like the same shit, but just on a different scale. And yeah, so my argument is trying to make like, you know, we need all alternatives, right? We need to critique anti-Asian, we need to mobilize against anti-Asian racism. And I kind of put a bit of my own personal, you know, I usually try not to go into that, but you know, just like, I'm just like, as a Chinatown organizer, it's just like, yeah, we've been like, you know, like I've been having these difficult conversations in my community for months, right? And I think just one moment that really got to me was, I mean, this is kind of small and marginal, but I think some people were trying to say like, I think it started off as a joke on Twitter. Someone was like, oh, the shooter in Atlanta also read Lausan and Chuang. That's how he got his anti-China. Yeah, it was pretty wild. But and then that went a little bit, like people thought that was real and became like a little bit. I think that just really, I just remember one day I was just like, yeah, I was just like coming back from just a bunch of organizing meetings on a Saturday, and it was just like seeing that, and it was just like I don't. It's like, first of all, it's like you don't know us, and like you don't know this type of stuff that we deal with, or the stuff that we've been working on, right? In terms of as people, you know, who are critical of the CCP, right, but also organizing against xenophobia very immediately in our immediate communities, right? And for me in Chinatown, and so it's like, who are you to say that? But you know, that's another thing aside. But the second thing is kind of just like, actually, how can we carve out an alternative program, right? Where we can hold all these things accountable to highlight the efforts of people, of voices who aren't softly pro CCP, right? Who are anti CCP, but also doing organizing work on the ground. And how can we think of all these efforts as congealing together, right? We're going to talk about anti-Asian violence in a much more expansive level that can include Uyghurs, right? That can include Asian voices like myself that, you know, like just like we face repression to, it's like, do I not count as anti-Asian violence just because, you know, like as a recipient of that because of Chinese oppression, just because it's not the US doing it, you know? And it's like, how can we have a discourse that can accommodate all these different perspectives, right? Was something I was trying to point to. And then I think one thing actually that was a larger stake to the piece, right, was actually pointing the fact that there are a lot of contradictions in the Asian American community, and some of these and we need to draw our lines. Like, we're not going to be, I would rather be in the same room and building a movement with a bunch of white socialists than Andrew Yang, than a bunch of these other Asian American liberals, right? And I think, and this is the same logic. It's like pro CCPers are not our friends, just like Asian American liberals who are gentrifying our communities are not our friends. And I think me highlighting this topic of delinking the CCP thing and anti-Asian racism thing points to this larger phenomenon that I'm trying to index in the Asian American community, right? Where it's actually, this is not the moment, well, you know, being polemical here, this is not the moment for unity, like among Asian Americans, right? This is precisely the moment for disunity, for drawing lines of demarcation, right? Against those who have been totally complicit. And, you know, this is right here, like 20 minutes away from me, right? With Asian American capitalist developers actively courting white people, white developers to gentrify and displace Asian American working class Asian Americans. And it's the same stuff with the CCP, right? It's not just looking at, you know, our ethnicity and trying to say like, this is the way to save Asian American communities and uplift Asian American voices, right? It's actually, no, it's better through coalition building. It's better through sorting through nuances. And actually, yeah, I'm standing against people who look like us, actually, who might actually bring about a more expansive and more genuine transformation for Asian American communities against racism and xenophobia and other types of things. And then I end with, yeah, just like, you know, pointing out people who have been doing the work, and you know, I think Tobita Chow and Jake Werner's stuff on progressive internationalism, I was like, I think that's been a very interesting starting point for us to think about, what it means to have progressive agendas that can connect both US and China systems of oppression, right? On a note of climate change, global labor rights, global migrant justice and stuff. How can we organize around these types of frameworks instead, right? As a way to kind of wrap up the intervention. So that, yeah, I think that's a short summary.
Yeah, no, that was good. Thanks. It sort of made me think of one thing that what you just said reminded me of is just there were lots of accusations of like Russophobia happening around the time of the hacking of the elections in the US, or the attempts of the other ones. And it was shortly after the annexation of Crimea as well in Ukraine. And so a lot of the online disinformation from the part of the Kremlin was sort of linked to, they sort of boosted one another with a lot of tankies, a lot of, I would just call them like opportunists, really, some like obsessive contrarians, like Glenn Greenwald and others, to basically say like any kind of criticism of the Russian government, even when legitimate, especially when legitimate, is basically Russophobia. And the thing is that Russophobia exists. There is an actual problem of the very black and white binary, if anything Russia related, that we see, or Russian people related specifically, that we see especially in American popular culture. It's one of the most widespread accepted forms of prejudice and bigotry that I know of, to be honest. Kind of like when I think of like anti-Gypsy hatred, or anti-Roma hatred, I should say, in Europe, it's just completely normalized. Like it doesn't even take that much thinking from most people, even who would call themselves progressives or liberals or whatever. It's just one of those things that is a problem. But my point is that this wasn't what was happening. This just wasn't what was happening. And there is a way of, then you want to be the person who, you don't want to deny the existence of hatred, you don't want to deny the existence of Russophobia, but the way it was being manipulated is actually harms the struggle against genuine Russophobia, if you see what I mean. And it's not a good parallel, because there has been a concrete rise in anti-Asian hatred and violence, as you've mentioned, of course, in the United States. It's not the same kind of situation, but in the ideosphere, in the space, online space especially, where these narratives are sort of battling themselves out, I definitely saw echoes of that. So I just wanted to kind of bring that up. Well, I mean, on that note, promise, this has really been a long and very productive conversation. I really thank you. If we can sort of end it on a bookish note, as I tend to enjoy doing, and if you can recommend 3 books for our listeners and explain why.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, thanks for having me, and yeah, it's been a really productive conversation. And yeah, I think always trying to learn more about the situation in the Middle East, and yeah, the connections between these international movements from below. Yeah, 3 books. Okay, so my first one is this one. It's a little obscure, but I think you can still find it online. It's called, shit, what's it called? Yeah, like China, but China, the revolution is dead, long live the revolution. It's a very obscure collection edited by this kind of anarchist group in the 70s in Hong Kong. And yeah, it has just a bunch of kind of anarchist, libertarian, communist, socialist takes on the Chinese system. And so you get like Raya Dunevskaya from the Johnson Forest Tendency, who had a piece, and yeah, a lot of like really obscure and underrated pieces coming from yeah, I just have a dedicated interest in dismantling the hegemony of Maoism, I think, in Chinese left circles, but also like, analysis of China. So this is really cool, and I think it's still available online through Black Rose Books or something. So yeah, there's one. And yeah, I mean, I'll just point out one essay that's particularly fascinating is called "The Dusk of Rationality" by Yu Su and Canto, like Yu Shui. And yeah, it's just like this libertarian comment. She was like a former Red Guards who fled the Cultural Revolution of Hong Kong and wrote this critique of Maoism and stuff. And it's very fascinating. My second book is also, now I just realized they're all coming for similar traditions, but this is Martin Glaberman, Punching Out and Other Writings. So this is like a pamphlet or a short collected collections by this guy who worked very closely with, he's like this white auto worker leftist who worked closely with C.L.R. James from that tradition as well. I guess he's, I don't know what you would call him now, libertarian socialist. I don't know, but he they had like a bit of falling out with like Grace Lee Boggs and that camp at a certain point, and then they went in their own direction as like the Correspondence Publishing Committee or something, all based in Detroit, right? So they're all very centered in like the kind of automobile workers organizing milieu, and connections with the League of Revolutionary Black Workers in Detroit. There's just like this amazing pamphlet on the nuts and bolts of what it means to organize in your workplace. Why, I'm not as critical of unions, I think, as he is, but he gives a very nuanced depiction of why unions, bureaucratic unions, are bad, and the need for workers to invent new forms of organization, right, grounded on their own perspectives. And it's very nitty gritty. It talks about like the workplace day by day and the Ford like motor company factories, but there's also like larger stuff on him critiquing Hal Draper, which I do. It was one of the first people I read actually on the left, on like the student movement and relationship to workers' movements in the United States. So it can be nitty gritty, but also talks a lot about just like what it means to organize and why organize, and what mass movement or new forms of organization should be like. So Martin Glaberman, Punching Out, and Other Writings. And then my last one is this more recent one that came out called Beyond Survival by Juris Dixon and Leah Lakshmi Piepsna Samrashina. This is on, I think, AK or PM Press, one of those. And it's actually about transformative justice. And I think honestly, there's been, I think there's a lot of talk about, this is like ideas and shit and what like organizing or ideas and stuff, but there's actually not a lot enough in discourse about how to sort out differences within internal communities, organizing spaces, right? And what it means for us to work with each other and work through differences, but also work through harm and stuff, right? In a way. And I feel like, this collection is a really real one. And there's some folks interviewed or written that I kind of personally know who are just amazing organizers. And thinking about kind of a decolonial libertarian look at transformative justice and why that's critical to political organizing and us thinking about politics, because this is literally, it's not just about ideas or which tendency we come out of or analysis of the state, right? It's kind of like directly connected to, okay, so how do we start organizing for a positive model of community building, right? That can work through differences without the police, without the state, and without all these things, right? And I feel like we talk more about abolishing the state than thinking about alternatives kind of right here and now, right? And then these problems, obviously I don't profess expertise in this, right? I'm definitely still learning and also trapped in the middle of a bunch of internal conflicts all the time in organizations, right? But I think if we can't sort out how to navigate through different abuse and harm in our own spaces, then it's hard for us to keep imagining a truly inclusive world forward that can look beyond, right, the failures and the mistakes of actually existing socialist states, right? Cuba or Soviet Union and other things, right? How can we actually imagine a true libertarian future for all marginalized and working people? And I think it starts here, with how you can organize in your own space, with especially when problems come out. So Beyond Survival, there's 3 books, and I can send links later.
The last one is by AK Press. I just looked it up while you were talking. Okay, I mean, on that note, Promise Lee, thanks a lot for your time.
Thank you.
Fire These Times is made possible by supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to support through a monthly donation, you can head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes. And if you want to explore other options, you can do so by checking out the website.